All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Begin by thanking our sponsor, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating all the Shurim Drushos this month in memory of Paul's grandparents, Dina Bas Pesach and Zechariah ben Zechariah. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamas will have an Aliyah and the family in Nechama. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, Raishin Chavi Abramson, for dedicating the parak of Arvei Pesachim in the Zechus of Rafu Shlema for Daniel Meir ben Chana. And to thank Richard Bell for dedicating the Daf Yomi Shir this morning in honor of his cousin Phil Miller on the occasion of his birthday, Mazel Tov, and Ameh Ve'esim Shanim Tovos. All right, so with that, let us begin. So a lot to do today, a really incredible sugya. So the last two lines, so today's daf is Kuf Gimel 103. We are picking up on Kuf Beis and Beis 102b at the Gufa. So 2 lines from the bottom, Seudas. Gufa. So I'll say, here we go. This is a very shayach sugya for this year. Yom Tov Shechal Yosachar Shabbos. So I'll say we already began to allude to this yesterday, feels like last year. So it says, Gufa, Yom Tov Shechal Yosachar Shabbos. What happens when Yom Tov falls out on Motzei Shabbos? So I'll say, just to understand, oh, you know what, before I forget, 1 second, there was one thing I meant to text out, which I'm just going to do right now. Okay, great. Now you'll be able, Meretz Hashem, to reference this as we discuss. Mamish, I hear no pinging. That's incredible. Everybody has no sound. Wow. Did it go through? Good, excellent. So we'll say, so again, we'll see again. Don't look at it yet. I don't want to ruin the surprise, Meretz Hashem, but you'll see. We'll get to this in just a moment. So we'll say, so remember, okay. So remember, we began discussing this last night. When I go from Shabbos into Yom Tiv, so the question we have to deal with is as follows. There are a number of things that have to happen. There's Kiddush for Yom Tiv, but there's also an entire Havdallah from Motzei Shabbos. So how does one go ahead and structure this process? So this is our subject for today. So get ready for this. Be a little bit of a Talmudic roller coaster. Very exciting. Strap in. Kufa. Yom Tov Shechal Yosachar Shabbos. Rav Amar Yakna. So Rav says you say Yayin Kiddush Ner Havdallah. So I will say, as we're going to see, each of these particular opinions have a svara. We are not going to get into all of the svaras, but we'll just outline some general parameters. So, for example, take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. So Rav says the order is Yayin. Yayin, of course, is Hagafen. Kiddush, which would be Kiddush for Yom Tiv. Ner, Borei Ma'orei Ha'ish. And Havdallah. Good. So Rashbam says over here, Rav Amar Yakna, Sfira Lei, Kiddushas Hayom Adifa Mehavdallah. So we'll say this. What we're going to see over here is that the machlokes that we're going to run into is which should come first on Motzei Shabbos going into Yom Tiv. Should Havdallah come first or should Kiddush come first? So in Rav's model, clearly Kiddush comes first. Why does Kiddush come first? Rav says, Sirle Kiddush Adifa Mehavdallah Inami Dichi Mavdal Bereisha Mechzi Tahavi Ale Kiddushas Hayom Kimasui. So say, Rav's logic is like this. You have to make Kiddush first. Because if you go ahead and you make Havdallah first, what does it look like? Rav says, it looks like you're just quick to unload the Kiddush of Shabbos. You're making it look like Shabbos is a masui. Shabbos is a burden to you, and that's why you're making Havdallah first. Lefichach, Yain Kodem Lekiddush Kebeisilo. Good, we don't have to get into Yain right now, but we'll say, this is going to be very important. So therefore, Rav says, Kiddush comes before Havdallah, not really because we want to put Kiddush first, but it's more that what? We don't want to put Havdallah first. I don't want to put Havdallah first because then it looks like Shabbos is a Maseh. So we'll say this is actually very interesting because remember, this goes back to what we saw yesterday as well of this motif in Chazal of Ein Osin Mitzvos Chavilos. We never want to make mitzvos look like a burden. So we don't bundle mitzvahs because it looks like I want to just discharge as much as I can at once. And therefore, again, we want to make Havdallah less. Even though I both say, if you think about it, it's totally, to a certain degree, it's counterintuitive. Why? Because if you're making Kiddush, by definition, what does that mean? Shabbos is over, right? So even though, again, it's clear through my Kiddush that Shabbos is over, Rav is concerned that if the first thing you start with is Havdallah, it has the appearance. So I'll say, so by the way, this comes up, there's so much to talk about on these things. This comes up, Matzei Shabbos Chanukah. There's a whole discussion about what's the proper order for Neros Chanukah and Havdallah. So this is a discussion in my home that our family minhag always was to do Ner Chanukah and Havdallah. I say our family minhag until I got married and I was given a new family minhag. It's interesting, yeah, that happens. But I've always felt like it's totally counterintuitive to go ahead and light Neros Chanukah before Havdallah. So I said, no, because the whole yesod is you want to push off, you want to delay the exit of Shabbos as long as possible. You don't want to, but again, the taina, of course, the taina back is, but that's ridiculous. That was actually a quote, right? That's ridiculous because obviously, if you're lighting Neros Chanukah, of course Shabbos is over. So of course that's true. Of course that's true. But at the end of the day, there's a difference between recognition that Shabbos is over and Havdallah. And we see this concept, says Rav, we push off the formal Havdallah as much as we can. So again, I will say, I just want to point out just the fact that we're seeing this theme of Ein Osin Mitzvos Chavilos is also so important because also even in the way we conduct ourselves in our home with our, if a person has children who see them, a person has to be so careful because sometimes even unknowingly we could paint a picture that, mitzvahs is such a burden. Yiddishkeit, there's so many obligations, and I'm rushed, and I'm stressed, and all this. Again, a person has to be so careful that the way they live and the way they practice their Yiddishkeit doesn't have the appearance of chavilos. To practice Yiddishkeit in a way which emotes a sense of privilege. Now, I will tell you what's something very interesting. Tosfos comes along. This is why we're never going to finish this. All right, but we'll go get through it. Tosfos comes along, and Tosfos says, 1 second. You're missing something, Rav. What is Rav missing? Say, what is he missing? Besamim. So look at this. This is incredible. Rav Amar Yakna umashin maskir besamim. Why doesn't Tosfos bring up? Why doesn't Rav bring up besamim? So Perush Rashbam the tam besamim humishum ibud neshama yisera. Both say this is so beautiful. Why do we smell besamim on Matzei Shabbos? Because there's a concept the Gemara brings down that on Shabbos you have a neshama yisera, literally an extra neshama, really added dimension of holiness. When Shabbos goes away, the neshama yisera departs, and that leaves my residual neshama, we'll call it, in a sense of sadness. Ubi yom tov nami ika neshama yisera. So this is incredible. Tosfos says you don't need besamim on Yom Tiv. Why? Because on Yom Tiv there's also a neshama yisera. The kasha dimkein b'matzei Yom Tiv amai lo takino besamim. I'm sorry. The Gemara says lekach nira b'yom tov leka nami yisham. So Tosfos says here's the problem with that. If that's true that on Yom Tiv there's a neshama yisera, then what? I will say then what? Why don't you have besamim as part of Havdallah on Matzei Yom Tiv? Right? There's no besamim. So again, b'manav shach, you're telling me that there's no besamim when you go from Shabbos into Yom Tiv because there's still an neshama yisera on Yom Tiv. Well, if there's an neshama yisera on Yom Tiv, then you should use besamim on Matzei Yom Tiv. A good kasha. So also listen to this. Fish also says you're right. You're right. Lekach nira to be Yom Tiv leka neshama yisera. There is no neshama yisera on Yom Tiv. Listen to this. So then why don't we use besamim from Shabbos going into Yom Tiv? V'hacha in maskir besamim mishum de simchas Yom Tiv v'achila ushtiya moil kimo besamim. Listen, this is so beautiful. So Tosfos says, because what does besamim do? Right? Besamim, it's the reach, it's the pleasing scent of the besamim that awakens simcha within the residual neshama. So Tosfos says, achila and shtiya, meat and wine of Yom Tiv, simchas Yom Tiv, could do that as well. Therefore, again, keep going with besamim. So I'm sorry. So again, so therefore, I will say. So this is an incredibly important Tosfos. So really, what Tosfos tells us is number one, there is no neshama yisera on Yom Tiv. So why no besamim? So first of all, now I understand why we don't use besamim on Matzei Yom Tiv. But why no besamim from Matzei Shabbos into Yom Tiv? To which Tosfos says besamim are there to be me'orer simcha. When you have Yom Tiv, the simchas Yom Tiv itself has the ability to infuse additional simcha into the residual neshama. Incredible. Tosfos says something interesting. He says, "V'yesh tamim lo nechonim," and there are many other reasons that people give, but they're wrong. V'zeh tam nachon v'ikar, And this is the reason. So I'll say this is a great Tosas also. There's an incredible Musar Haskell. I will say, not every opinion is right. And just because someone says something doesn't automatically endow it with legitimacy. We kind of live in a time where if somebody says something or somebody believes something, you have no right to go ahead and disagree with someone else's version of the truth. It's not true, says Tosas. Yes, of course, there's definitely room for differences of opinion, but in life there are also things that are correct, and there are things that are incorrect. And Tosas says, and there's a profound thing, there are a lot of things that people say that is just unequivocally wrong. And if everything is MS, then nothing is MS. Person has to find the courage to be able to discern. Ultimately, again, what's MS, what's sheker? Be able to identify and call out sheker, and be able to stand up for MS. The Gemara goes weiter. Good, we're making some good headway here. Shmuel Amar. Shmuel says, good, we're up to, if you lost the place, we're one line from where we started. I will say, Shmuel Amar, still on Kuf Beis Amud Beis. Shmuel says, no, the order is Yanhak, Yayin Ner Havdallah Kiddush. So we'll say Shmuel's opinion is, ultimately again, that Havdallah comes before Kiddush. Now we'll see Shmuel's logic in just a moment. The Gemara is actually going to spend more time on Shmuel's position than Rav's position, as we're going to see. But again, the Iker Machlokes, I will say over here, is what comes first, Kiddush or Havdallah? Rav says Kiddush first. We see the Svara. Ultimately, again, because Halacha L'Maisa, we don't want it to look like I'm just dumping Shabbos. And Shmuel is going to say no, Havdallah comes first. Top of Kuf Gimel. But say this is great. So Rava says Yahanak. So we'll say, so now we get into some other machloksim in terms of the order of Havdallah and Ner, which we're not going to step into right now. But Rav says again, Yayin Havdallah Ner Kiddush, Levi Amar Kanya, right? Kiddush Ner Yayin Havdallah. So we'll say, as you begin to see, the major machlokis we're going to focus on is the Kiddush Havdallah one. But as you begin to see already here, even within the other brachas, there's other machloksim regarding the order. Rabbanan Amri Kino. The Rabbanan say the order is Kiddush Yayin Ner Havdallah. Marbrei Ravna Amar Nikiya Ner Kiddush Yayin Havdallah. Marsa Mished Rabbi Yeshua Nihak. So okay, Ner Yayin Havdallah Kiddush. So we'll say, now listen to this. So now there's a whole variety of opinions. So it comes along. So the father of Shmuel sent the following message to Rabbi. Then Rabbeinu, Seder Havdallah, Heich. So we'll say at the end of the day, so now you have Avud Shmuel sends to Rabbi. Rabbi, what is the order? Okay, so now we see a lot of different opinions. So what is the proper Seder for Matzei Shabbos going into Yom Tov? Which I will say is very shaykh for us this year. Shalach lei kach amar Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi shar mishum aviv shar mishum Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya. The proper order for Matzei Shabbos is Nihiyak, Ner Havdallah Yayin Kiddush. Ner Havdallah Yayin Kiddush. Now I will say, as we're good, if you take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Actually, before we look at the Rashbam, Rabbi Chanina, Mashal Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya. So we'll say so again. So Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya says proper order Ner Havdallah Yayin Kiddush. So remember, the important part to remember over here, and this is going to be the focus of Rabbi as well, is the placement of Havdallah before Kiddush. Of Havdallah before Kiddush. So we'll say, so why would you put Havdallah before Kiddush? So listen to this. Rabbi Chanina, Mashal Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya lemelech. So we'll say the mashal is as follows. If you could, here's how you understand. It's beautiful. Lemelech sheyatza va'farchus nichnas. So we'll say, imagine for a moment you have the king with you, and now the king is getting ready to leave, but there's a nobleman, right? Farchus means like a duke, right? There's a duke who's now coming to visit you. So you've got two things now to deal with. You need to escort the king out, and you need to welcome the duke in. Which one would you give your attention to first? Malavin es hamelech, va'acher kach yotzim likras hafarchus. So the proper behavior is first you take care of the king. First you escort the king out, and then you welcome the duke or the nobleman in. So of course in the Nimshal, the king is Shabbos, the duke is Yom Tiv, and therefore Rebbe says, or actually Rabbi Chanina explains Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya's position is Havdallah will always come before Kiddush, because at the end of the day it is proper protocol to first escort the Shabbos out before you welcome the Havdallah in. If you look at the Rashbam for just a moment, the Rashbam says it's in the intermediate lines, about 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines in. Shom Mishrom V'Shom and Chananya Nehiyak. V'tayim Kidim V'Farish L'Kamon. The Havdallah Kodem L'Kiddush. V'Hilchach Ner Tchila. Sherotze Litain Yayin Samuch L'Havdallah. So both say, see, here's what's interesting about this opinion. The Rashbam points out. Once you establish that Havdallah is going to come before Kiddush, and that's the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, and this sounds like what Rabbi Yehuda Nasi agrees with also. So once I establish that Havdallah is first, and why is Havdallah first? Because again, it's more appropriate to escort out the king before you welcome in the nobleman. Okay, so now once Havdallah is first, so now Rabbi Yeshua will say as follows. The next thing you want to do is you want to put Ner first. Now, why do you want to put Ner first? So we'll say this is actually very interesting. The reason you want to put Ner first is not really because Ner needs to be first, but rather because I want Yayin sandwiched in between Havdallah and Kiddush. Because you also remember again, that Borei Priagafen, this is what we saw in yesterday's daf, that Borei Priagafen is servicing Havdallah and Kiddush. What about Ein Osin Mitzvos Chavilos? So what did we say? It's one thing, right? Kiddush v'Havdallah is Chada Milsehi. It's one thing, it's not Chavilos. What's interesting is as follows. So really, it's really fascinating. So Rabbi Yeshua Hananiah's model, here's how you construct the order. Step 1, is establishing priority between precedence between Kiddush and Havdallah. So again, in Rabbi Yeshua's model, Havdallah is first. So Havdallah, Kiddush. Okay. Now the next thing I want to do is I need to put Yayin in between the two of them. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, I'm going to put it in the middle. So I'm going to do Havdallah, Yayin, Kiddush. That gives me my hik, right? Hey, Yud, Kuf, right? So I've got my Havdallah, my Yayin, my Kiddush. We'll say, so there's only one place to put Ner. Where can I put Ner? Right? I can't put it at the end. Why can't I put it at the end? I've already made Kiddush, right? So it doesn't make sense to put the Ner of Havdallah after Kiddush. Therefore, what? There's only one place to put it, at the beginning, which therefore gives me Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananiah's model of Nihiyak. Ner, Havdallah, Yayin, Kiddush. So the Ner is just placed kind of in the only place where it can be, but really what drives this is it's got to be Havdallah, Kiddush, Yayin's got to service both of them, so it's put there in the middle, and therefore the Ner is put first. Good, very interesting. So the Gemara goes weiter. So my Havdallah. So we'll say, so bottom line says the Gemara. So no, what's the bottom line? And I will say, now interestingly enough, from all of this discussion, the one thing also that's been absent is Zman. What about Shechianu? Right now, remember, now this goes back to what the Gemara was saying yesterday. That this sounds like maybe this is a discussion regarding Shvi'i Shal Pesach, right? The last days of Pesach, because the last days of Pesach do not get their own Shechianu. This is different than the last days of Sukkot, because remember, the last days of Sukkot are dramatically different than the last days of Pesach. For the simple reason, last days of Sukkot are Shmini Atzeres, which is a Yom Tov, a regel bifnei atzmo. But remember again, we'll see this in Sukkah. With the ways in which Shmini Atzeres is different than Sukkot is Pizar Kishav. We'll see that in Mirat Hashem. Pizar Kishav, 6 different ways in which Shmini Atzeres, but the Zayin of Pizar ultimately is Zman. But the last days of Pesach are not like that. So it's interesting that this discussion really begins kind of focusing just in general on Yom Tov. But now what about Zman? So here we go. So my Havdallah. So we'll say, this is a burning question for us because Halach Lamaisa, this is Shaykh for this year. This is the first night of Pesach. Matzah Shabbos. So what do I do? Here we go. My Havdallah, Abai Amar Yak Zino. So Abai says, we go ahead and we say Yak Zino, which is Yayin, Kiddush, Zman, Ner Havdallah. So remember, a lot of these things are driven. So remember, according to Abai is going to say he goes back to the Rav model. And the Rav model is Kiddush always comes first. Why does Kiddush come first? Once again, the Svara, because I don't want Shabbos to look like a burden that I'm just trying to offload quickly. So we'll make Kiddush first, and ultimately, again, Havdallah last. So you have Yayin, Kiddush, Zman, because the Shechianu, of course, goes with Kiddush, and then we'll do the Havdallah piece. The Rava says, Yak Nahaz. Wow. So we'll say Yak Nahaz. Rava says, no, the proper order is Yayin, Kiddush, Ner, Havdallah, Zman. That ultimately, again, so Kiddush comes first, like Rav, Kiddush comes first, because Halakha Lamaisa, that is the appropriate way to go ahead and delay the official departure of Shabbos, and ultimately again put Havdallah last. Yaknahaz. So v'hilchasa, and halacha Rabosai follows like Rava. Ultimately again the halacha is Yaknahaz. If you take a look at the Rashbam, so the Rashbam says v'hilchasa kirava da'amar Yaknahaz de kidusha v'hadra Havdallah v'chi mavdil bereisha nechse dahavi alei kidushas de Shabbos kimasei. Because Rabosai at the end of the day, what drives this model is as follows. So what drives this model is going to be Kiddush needs to come first, because if you make Havdallah first, it looks like you're offloading Shabbos, that Shabbos is a masui. Shabbos is a burden. Therefore, do Yayin Kiddush, Ner Havdallah, so do your Kiddush, then your Havdallah, and ultimately, again, your Zman, your Shechianu Vikimanu Vigiyanu at the end. So I will say, interestingly enough, why is Zman at the end? See, that's strange, right? Because you would have thought, if you were putting the model together, how would you have put it together? Let's go through this. Okay, let's assume we accept the premise that Kiddush has to be first, right? So I'm going to do Yayin, Kiddush. What would you have put next? Zman, right? That makes sense, because Zman, right, it's the Yom Tiv. So get all the Yom Tiv stuff done first, and then Ner Havdallah, Yak Zina, which was the opinion of Abaye. That makes a lot of sense. So why does Rav say Yak? Now, so we'll say, now watch this. This is incredible. If you take a look at the first wide line in the Rashbam, it's kind of in the middle over here. So actually the second, the last and the intermediate wide lines. Here we go. V'Rava Sirale, Mamatzinu b'chol makom, Zman lebasof, Hachanami Zman lebasof, V'taimo shadavar. We'll say, why would you put Shechianu at the end? Here we go. Tizman omro afilu b'shuk, v'ikaro alakos, Hilchach omro lebasof. They'll say, this is fascinating. Shechianu is not tethered to Kiddush. I'll give you the perfect example. Let's say you forgot to say Shechianu. You forgot to say Shechianu in Kiddush. So what do you do? I'll say, what do you do? What do you do? You say it whenever you remember it. The Gemara's lashon is afilu b'shuk. Even if you're out in the marketplace and you said, I didn't say Shechianu. No problem. Just say it there. Shechianu is a din in Yom Tiv. It's not a din in Kiddush. We happen to arrange it as part of Kiddush, but Lamaisa, it's a din in Yom Tiv, and you can really say it wherever and whenever. So I will say, so now this whole thing comes together so beautifully. So what's the halacha Lamaisa? When Matzei Shabbos is Yom Tiv, Yayin Kiddush, because Kiddush comes first, not even so much because Kiddush comes first, but because what? Because what? Because Havdallah needs to come last. That's really what it is. Delay the official departure of Shabbos, so it shouldn't look like Shabbos is a burden to me. So Yayin Kiddush for Yom Tov first. Ner Havdallah, because I need to make Havdallah. No B'samim, why not? Why not? Because again, the Tosa says, because remember, even when I lose my Neshama Yisera, the Simchas Yom Tov, the physical celebration of Yom Tov, will give me the Simcha that B'samim would have normally given me. And then last, Zman. Why is Zman last and not attached to Yayin and Kiddush? Because technically speaking, Zman could be said whenever. So, and this is very important. Therefore, again, Zman comes at the end. It's not really a function. We tether it to Kiddush, but Lamais, that's not a function of Kiddush, it's a function of Yom Tov. Beautiful. So the PDF that I sent out was just a copy of Kiddush. So you can now see, first of all, a lot of times, especially when Matzei Shabbos is Yom Tov, there's like a lot of confusion about what to do. So now I will say, it's Yaknahaz. That's it. It's Yaknahaz. It's straight out. And now and once you understand, like most things in Yiddishkeit, once you understand the logic behind it, it's actually quite intuitive. It actually makes an incredible amount of sense. But I will say, but what we also begin to see is this institutionalized idea of Shalom Tehevi Alav Kimasui. Chazal felt it's so important that you never give off the impression that your Yiddishkeit is a burden. Because if you give off that impression, number one, it impacts, of course, how you feel about your Yiddishkeit. But of course, from a chinuch perspective, it'll impact ultimately how my children feel as well. You see, Chazal were so concerned about this that literally, again, that dictates the order on Matzei Shabbos. We'll therefore put Kiddush ultimately again before Havdallah. Good. I will say there's a lot of hashkafa in Yaknahaz as well. Incredible hashkafa. But we'll save it for a different time in Meretz Hashem. It'll remind me. Rav Huna bar Yehuda, Ikel Rav. So listen to this. Here we go. So Rav Huna bar Yehuda went to the house of Rava. Aisu lekamaihu ma'or ubisamim. So it was Matzei Shabbos. It was Matzei Shabbos. I will say now the Rashbam points out over here This is not Matzah Shabbos of Yom Tov. This is just a stam Matzah Shabbos. Rashbam says, but Matzah Shabbos shel Chol. Just a regular Matzah Shabbos. Okay, so now, Rav Huna Bar Yehuda is at the home of Rava, and they brought out Ma'or, a candle, a ner, and Besamim. Baruch Rava Abesamim Bereisha, V'Hadir Ama'or. So Rava first made the bracha of Borei Minei Besamim, and then he made the bracha of Borei Ma'orei Ha'ish. Amarle, so Rav Huna Bar Yehuda was intrigued by this. He said, "V'ha bein Beis Shammai or bein Beis Hillel ma'or b'reisha v'adar b'samim." But both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that first you make a bracha on the candle, and then you make a bracha on the b'samim. So why Rava did you do b'samim and then eish? Umayhi, what are you referring to when you say Beis Shammai Beis Hillel? What is that referring to? This nan, here we go. Beis Shammai omrim ner umazon b'samim v'havdallah. So we'll say this goes back to something we discussed yesterday, which is, what happens if you had shalosh shudas, right? And now you only have one kos. So you have to bench, but you also have to say Havdallah. So what's the proper order? So remember, again, I will say when did we get into this topic? We got into this topic with, again, ein osim mitzos chavilos. So remember, again, we discussed that the case in question over here is where you only have one cup of wine. So in general, yes, of course, we all agree, ein osim mitzos chavilos. But if halacha l'maisa I only have one cup of wine, then ein achinami, under those circumstances, I can go ahead and use them for both. So what's the proper order? Umayhi disnan Beis Shammai omrim ner umazon b'samim v'havdallah. So Beis Shammai says the proper order is borei ma'orei ha'eish, benching b'samim havdallah. Beis Hillel omrim ner u'b'samim mazon v'havdallah. And Beis Hillel have a different order. They say ner b'samim, but again, for our purposes, what do you see from both of them? Both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree. Both say that what? That's what? That ner comes before b'samim. They're both agreeing on that. They're disagreeing about everything else, but they agree that ner comes before b'samim. So therefore, I'm going to say what's happening over here. So Rav Huna Bar Yehuda is at the house of Rava. Rava's making Havdallah, and Rava makes the bracha on b'samim before ner. So Rav Huna says to him, I don't understand. Everybody agrees that ner comes before b'samim. So what are you doing? So the Gemara says, Ani Rava Basrei. So Rava says, you forgot the end of the Brisa, or the end of the Mishnah. The Gemara says, Va'amar zu div Rabbi Meir. That was Rabbi Meir's version of the Machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. Aval Rabbi Yehuda Omer lo nechlaku Beis Shammai Beis Hillel ala mazon shu betchila v'al Havdallah shi basof. So what's Rabbi Yehuda's model? He says like this: Beis Shammai Beis Hillel agree that halacha l'maisa, the first thing you do is you bench, and the last thing you do is Havdallah. Those are the bookends of this process. Aman nechlaku. So what do they argue about? Al hamar ve'al habisamim. What they argue about ultimately again is the order of ner and bisamim. Beis Shammai omrim ma'or v'achar kach b'samim. So Beis Shammai says the proper order is the ma'or, is the ner, and then b'samim. Ubeis Hillel omrim b'samim v'achar kach ma'or. Beis Hillel says ultimately again, first the order is b'samim and then the ner. Rabbi Yochanan says, Nagua am ke Beis Hillel v'alibud Rabbi Yehuda. The people conduct themselves in accordance with Beis Hillel, but Rabbi Huda's version of Beis Hillel. Namely, I will say that the proper order on Matzah Shabbos is b'samim and then ner, which I will say, as we know, halacha l'maisa is the practice that we follow. We first make the bracha of borei minei b'samim, and ultimately, again, we then go ahead and make the bracha on the ner. So I will say, it's actually very interesting that if you think about this almost from a certain like hashkafic level, so what does it mean? What's the machlokes over here? So if you think about it, the ner and the b'samim serve two different purposes. So the point of the ner, right? The ner represents, yes, on one hand, we're going to discuss actually in just a little bit, the idea that historically fire was created or given to man on Matzah Shabbos. We had a whole machlokes about this in Shabbos, Masechah Shabbos, about when exactly fire was created, right? Fire of man, fire of Gehenna, all the Masechah Shabbos we saw. I will say, but what fire also represents, the notion of ner as part of Havdallah, ner represents dynamic activity. Malacha. So the idea is Shabbos, I couldn't do malacha, I light a ner, I'm going to begin malacha. B'samim represents again awakening of spirituality. Right? Remember again, I had the Neshama Yisera, as Tosas just told me, had the Neshama Yisera, the Neshama Yisera is gone, but I need to awaken my ruchnius. So the Machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel is really a fascinating one, which is what is the proper approach to life? So halacha l'maisa, do you light the ner first? Do you engage in dynamic activity? And as a result, awaken your neshama? or do you awaken your neshama and first engage in dynamic activity? So what's interesting is, in general, we adopt the approach that really ner should come before besamim. That's the general approach we take in life. That in Yiddishkeit, I don't wait till I feel inspired to engage in dynamic activity. There are people who sit on the couch their whole lives, metaphorically, waiting to be inspired, right? Waiting to be uplifted, waiting for that gust of ruchnius to take them and accomplish something. And usually it doesn't work. So normally in life, first you light the ner, engage in dynamic activity, and then the besamim, the neshama yesera comes. There's one exception to this rule the Gemara is teaching us, which is on Motzei Shabbos. On Motzei Shabbos, the most important thing, sometimes Havdallah, Havdallah is it's like a stepping stone, right? So it's a stepping stone for Motzei Shabbos, right? The goal is to get to Motzei Shabbos, whatever you're doing on your Motzei Shabbos, and Havdallah is like the necessary evil, right? I gotta get through Havdallah, but usually Havdallah many times is not considered to be an overly reflective period. Havdallah is one of the holiest moments. Because in Havdallah, a person has to decide what they want to accomplish that week. What do you want to do? What do you want to be? The goal of Havdallah is not quick, finish up, let's get back to the world. You take a few extra moments and you decide, what do I want to accomplish? Who do I want to be in this coming week? What kind of light am I going to bring into the world? So amazingly enough, what Beis Hillel says, and this is the halacha l'maisa, what Beis Hillel says is, normally throughout the life of a Jew, it's usually first ner and then besamim. Dynamic activity creates inspiration. On Motzei Shabbos, your inspiration has to come first. On Motzei Shabbos, you have to go ahead and have your besamim. Motzei Shabbos, you have to take that deep breath and tell yourself, I have a whole week of dynamic activity in front of me. What do I want to be? Who do I want to be? What do I want to accomplish? Once you have that machshava, once you have that neshama yisera, then you could light your ner. That's the power of Motzei Shabbos. So the Gemara goes weiter. Rav Yaakov bar Abba ikil lebei Rava. Rav Yaakov Abba went to the house of Rava. Chazye de barich bari priagafen akasa kama. So what happened? So we'll say it's actually very interesting as well. So we saw, we'll say, again, this is not Havdallah, well, we'll get to Havdallah, but right now, again, it's just stam case. So Rav Yaakov bar Abba went to the house of Rava, and he saw that Rava made a bari priagafen on the first cup of wine. So they were drinking wine together, and Rava made a bracha on the first cup. V'hadir barach hakasa dibrachasa v'ishti, and then he made another bracha on the cup of wine used for birkas hamazon, for benching. So they were drinking wine, then they benched, and ultimately Rav Yaakov bar Abba saw that Rava made a bracha on the first cup and on the benching cup. Amar le lamalach kulehai. Why do you have to make a bracha on the cup you used for birkas hamazon? In other words, why doesn't the hagafen you made on the first cup of wine suffice for the cup of benching as well? You already made a bracha. Amarle, so Rabbi said, I'll explain to you. Because when I was in the house of the Reish Kalusa, this is what they did. They would make a hagafen on wine they drank during the meal, and they would also make another hagafen ultimately on the kos used for benching. Amarle tenach bereish kalusa tahach yavid the safik maisilan safik lo maisilan. To which Rav Yaakov bar Abba says back to Rava, I understand. However, in the house of the Reish Kalusa, it's different. Rabbi said there's a fascinating concept in Hilchos Brachas that called nimlach. Nimlach means that if you eat something, you drink something, and then you decide to eat or drink more, you didn't have it in mind to begin with, you have to make another bracha. So Rav Yaakov bar Abba says back to Rava, when you were in the house of the Reish Kalusa, they gave you a cup of wine, you drank your wine, you have no idea if they're offering you any more wine. So because of that, you assume the cup that you get is the cup that you get, so you make a bracha. When they would then bring you a second cup, that was like panim chadashos ba'alakan, right? It's a new thing. And that's how you had to make another bracha. But Rava, we're in your house. Hacha, hamarach kasa kaman, v'daitani luya. But here, you knew you were going to drink a cup of wine during the meal, and you knew you were going to drink a cup of wine during benching. All of that wine was present, and therefore, again, the cup of wine used for benching should be included in your original bracha. To which the Gemara says, good. The Gemara says, Amrle, so Rav said, you're right. Ana avdi kitamidi de Rav. In reality, I conduct myself like the students of Rav. What does that mean? Says the Gemara. The Rav Baron, Rav Chananel, Talmidi de Rav, Hal Yasvi Seudas. Because one time, Rav Baron and Rav Chananel, who were the students of Rav, were sitting in a Suda, Amud Beis. Kayu alayu Rabbi Eva Sava. So Rabbi Eva Sava was serving them. They're both saying it's interesting. So apparently, what used to be the practice in Zman Gemara is that when you would have a group of Rabbanim sitting together, they would take turns serving as the waiter. So again, you have these two Talmidim of Rav Barona, Rav Hananel are sitting, and Rav Yeva Sava is serving them. Amrulei, they said to him, Havlon v'nevarich. So they said to Rav Yeva Sava, you know what, we're done with the meal, let's bench. Listen to this. L'sof Amrulei, Havlon v'nishti. Then they said to Rav Yeva Sava, you know what, we changed our mind. Let's have another glass of wine. Before we bench, let's have another glass of wine. And what was that? So ultimately, Rav Yeva Sava said back to them, Hachi Amarav, this is what Rav said, Kevan damrisu havlan v'nevarech. Once you say in a meal, let's bench, istira l'chu l'mishti. You're not allowed to drink anymore. We'll say, once you go ahead and you say, let's bench closes the meal. This is very interesting. This halacha l'maisa. Once you articulate your desire to bench, the meal is over, which then says that if you're going to eat or drink anymore, it requires a brand new bracha. So my time, what's the reason for this? Ultimately, again, the aschisu dataichu, because hesachadas. Once you say let's bench, that's clearly demonstrative that you're finished eating. Once you're finished eating again, then the brachas that you made to cover the initial act of eating are done. There's hesachadas. And Allah Khamais, if you want to eat more, you want to drink more, you can, but it requires a new bracha. I will say, now why is this important for us? Take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Asr l'chol mishti, alma birchas hamazon asuchi daitihu v'tzarach lachzor levarich la'achar birchas hamazon v'hachin agina. So we'll say, remember again. So Rava, remember again, we'll say, what happened over here? Rav Yaakov bar Abba into the house of Rava. He's observing Rava's behavior. And what does he see Rava do? Rava has a glass of wine, makes hagafen. Then Rava benches and makes another bracha over the kosher bracha, over the benching cup. Rav Yaakov says, I don't understand why you're doing this. Why doesn't your hagafen that you made on your original cup of wine also cover your hagafen that for your cup of birkas hamazon? To which Rava ultimately responds, that's because benching represents a hesech hadas, which makes sense. We'll say, what is benching? Benching is the closure of a meal. Now, what you see from this episode that he just quoted over here, not only is benching the closure of the meal, but even what? An articulation of a desire to bench is the close of the meal. So Rava says to Rav Yaakov bar Abba, if articulation of intent to bench is the closure of the meal, then certainly benching itself is the closure of the meal. Therefore, the bracha I made on wine during the meal cannot cover the cup of birkas hamazon, which is drunk at the end of benching. Benching clearly closes out the meal, which then limits the effectiveness of the bracha. That's why for the cup of birkas hamazon, I made another bracha. Incredible. Another story. Ameimar Umar Zocha v'Ravashi Havu Yossi Besuda. Ameimar, Marzucha and Ravashi all sat together ultimately again in their Seuda. Okay, V'kaya alayu Rav Acha berei de Rava. And Rav Acha berei de Rava, he was the waiter. This goes back to the Talmudic practice I just mentioned, that they would switch off being the waiters for each other. So we'll say, now watch this. Here we go. This is great. So we'll say, what's very exciting about these stories, really riveting, is, for us, so halacha is codified. So you want to know what to do in any particular situation. It's not uncommon to be at a meal where there's a lot of people doing a lot of different things, but that's because a lot of them are just wrong, right? So again, today we know, right? Do you want to know if you open up a Shulchan Aruch? What's very exciting about these stories is you're talking about before the codification of halacha. So you could be sitting at a Seuda with a number of great Rabbanim, and they're all doing different things, which is really exciting. And if you're a Talmud and you're sitting there, because so much of having a Rebbe is not just, hearing his Torah, but observing what he does. The Talmidim are there looking at what's going on. So watch this. So these three great Rabbanim, Ameimar, Marzucha, Rav Ashi, are all sitting together, and Rav Acha berei Rava, he's the waiter. So why will say, watch this. Ameimar, Baracha kol kasa v'kasa. So Ameimar, he made a bracha on every single cup of wine. Right? Every cup of wine, he made his own bracha. Marzutra, Baruch HaKasa Kama VaKasa Basra. Marzutra, he made a bracha ultimately again on the first cup and on the last cup. Ravashi, Baruch HaKasa Kama V'Sula. Ravashi, he just made a bracha on the first cup and no more. No more. So Amru Ravacha bar Rava, Anan Kaman Nava. So we'll say Ravacha bar Rava, he's the waiter. So can you imagine this? He's the waiter. He sees three different Rabbanim doing three different things. He says, Chevra, what's the halacha? Right? What? I'm watching this. What should we do? So Ameimar Amar. So they will say now each of these Rabbanim explained their respective positions. So Ameimar said, Ana nimlachana. So Ameimar said, I'm going to be honest with you. Ameimar said, remember, Ameimar made a bracha on every single cup of wine. So Ameimar said, that's because when I drank the first cup, I kind of said to myself, okay, this is just going to be a 1-cup Suda. And then what happened? I had a second cup. So that's called, as I mentioned before, in Hilchos Brachos, nimlach. If you have in mind to only eat A, but then you decide to eat B, so logically, the bracha you made on A doesn't cover B. So therefore, again, I said, look, I was just going to go ahead and drink 1 cup of wine. I decided to drink another cup. I'm nimlach. I changed my mind, and therefore I had to make. And apparently, he changed his mind a couple of times. It sounds like, right? So he made a separate hagafen on every single cup of wine he had. Fine, Marzucha Amar. Marzucha said, "Ana da'avdi ki talmidei de Rav." Marzucha said, I conduct myself like the students of Rav. Because that was a story we just saw before. Students of Rav said, 1 hagafen could cover all of your wine during the meal, but benching stops the meal. So therefore, this hesach hadas, benching stops the meal. Therefore, again, one hagafen could cover all wine you drink during the meal, but the cost for benching is going to require its own hagafen. Rav Ashi says, what did Rav Ashi do? Rav Ashi, he made a bracha on the first cup of wine, and that was it, which apparently means even for the cup of wine for benching, Rav Ashi didn't make another bracha, because he said, Les hilchos kitamidei de Rav. He held that the halacha does not follow the students of Rav, namely, that the hagafen you make during the meal not only covers the hagafen of wine you drink during the meal, but even covers what? The cup of wine used for benching. Where does he get this from? Here we go. The Yom Tov shechalios achar Shabbos. Because I think about this just a moment. When Yom Tov falls out after Shabbos, going back to our original discussion, Va'amar Rav, and Rav said yakneha, which is how we paskin. We just add in the zayin over there. Yayin kiddush ner havdallah. So I will say, how does that prove anything? So if you look at the Rashba, Va'amar Rav yakneha. Velo boy lebruche berchas brepri agafen trei zimni chada kiddush v'chada avdallah v'adin letrei kasei the kiddush hayom berchas hamazon. So also listen to this. So this is incredible. So Rav Ashi says it's clear to me that when you make a hagafen on your wine in the meal, that covers you through benching, even the kosher berchas hamazon. Why? Because look at yaknaha. You're making yayin. You're making the hagafen where? At the beginning. Right? You're making yain at the beginning, and yet again, you're doing kiddush, ner, havdallah, and we don't say there's any kind of hefsek. There's no hefsek there. You don't have to make another hagafen by havdallah. So you see from here that anything that's part of a process is not going to be a hefsek. So too, again, Marzutra or Rav Ashi suggests that when you make the hagafen in your meal, you know you're going to bench. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, the hagafen you make in the meal covers you all the way through your hagafen and berkas hamazon. To which the Gemara says, it's not a good comparison. Hasam ikar daite mim shisa. Hasam akar daite mim shisa. Mim shasya. Hachalo akar daite mim shasya. To which the Gemara says, it's really not a fair comparison, I will say. Benching, the concept of benching, by definition means what? The cessation of eating. That's what benching is. Benching is the cessation of your meal. So it's what the Gemara calls akar mimishasya. You've uprooted yourself from the act of drinking. Benching, by definition, brings eating and drinking to an end. So to think that the hagafen I made during my meal should cover me for the brei pri hagafen of benching is counterintuitive. Masha'inke yaknahaz. We'll say again, yes, my das is this is all part of the kiddush process. Really, Rabbi say, you see what's interesting about this is as follows. How do you view yaknaz, Rabbi say? What is yaknaz from a halachic perspective? What is it really? It's a prolonged kiddush. That's really what yaknaz is. It's all kiddush. That's what this is. Just kiddush on Matzah Shabbos going into Yom Tov has a number of different components, including Havdallah. But Lamaisa, it's kiddush Leleil Yom Tov. Therefore, the Gemara says, Halacha Lamaisa, Halacha l'maisa, ultimately, again, they're not comparable. So Rabbi says, so again, we know that the halacha is that in such a case like this, if you're drinking during a meal, so again, if you have in mind to drink whatever you're going to drink over the course of the meal, one hagafet could cover anything. But if let's say when you make the hagafet, you have in mind that, no, I'm only having one glass of wine. Only have one glass of wine tonight. And then you change your mind during the course of the meal, that's called nimlach. And in fact, halacha l'maisa, you would have to make another bracha. And of course, it goes without saying that the hagafen you make during the meal does not cover you for birkas hamazon. I will say, let's just do one more line. Kimata la'avdule. So I will say, so remember again now, the Gemara is actually going back to the previous story. This was the story of Rav Huna bar Yehuda, who went to the house of Rava. Right? So also remember again, that was the story where he saw Rava make the bracha on Besamim before the Ner, and Rav Yehuda didn't understand this. So the Gemara picks up with that narrative, and the Gemara says, Kimata lavdule, when it was time for Havdallah, Kam sham eva adlik avuka mishraga. The servant of Rava went ahead and kindled a torch. Amar le lama lach kulehai. Why do you need a torch? Right now, both remember again, the chilik in halacha between an avuka and a ner. A ner is one wick. An avuka is anything made up of two or more wicks. So now Rav Yehuda sees this going, Rav Huna, I'm sorry. Rav Huna sees this. He sees that the servant of Rava lights an avuka, lights a torch for Havdallah. Says, why do you have to light a torch? Why can't you just use a ner? So the Gemara says, Amar le lama lach ha man chashraga. The candle's right there. Why do you need a torch? Just use the candle. But we'll stop over here. We'll pick up Amir Hashem with the answer to this. Leaving a little bit of a cliffhanger. We'll pick up Amir Hashem with this tomorrow.